President Joe Biden was in Chicago yesterday with an official speech about the economy, but really it was a campaign speech from beginning to end as he's seeking a second term in what's expected to be a just wild 2024 election cycle. Already is, as his chief opponent on the Republican side, seeking a Republican nomination, is facing several charges both in state and federal courts. So fascinating to see that play out. But of course, President Biden, apparently he's starting his campaigning, and in Chicago is where he kicked it off. Now, before he got to Chicago, he stopped at the White House to talk with media, just to show you, I guess, in a way, does the president know geography? He was asked about what's going on in Russia and if Putin is losing his foothold in that war with Ukraine.
To what extent has Vladimir Putin been weakened by recent events? It's hard to tell, but he's clearly losing the war in Iraq. He's losing the war at home.
What?
And he has become a bit of a pariah around the world.
He's losing the war in Iraq, President Joe Biden says. There's not a war that Russia is waging in Iraq, so that's just kind of bizarre. But the president got to Chicago, and he was introduced by several elected officials, from Senator Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth to Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Danny Davis and others. And then the president got up there to talk about Bidenomics. Bidenomics. What is Bidenomics? Well, he says he didn't come up with it, but regardless, here's what the president had to say about his economic policies moving forward during a speech yesterday in Chicago.
This vision is a fundamental break from the economic theory that has failed America's middle class for decades now. It's called trickle-down economics, fundamental economics, trickle-down. The idea was, it's belief that we should cut taxes for the wealthy and big corporations. And I know something about big corporations. There's more corporations in Delaware incorporated than every other state in the union combined. I want them to do well, but I'm tired of waiting for the trickle down. It doesn't come very quickly. Not much trickle down at my dad's kitchen table growing up. Tax cuts for the wealthy. It wasn't paid for, and the estimated cost of his tax cut was $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Now Republicans are at it again, pushing tax cuts for large corporations and the wealthy, and adding trillions of dollars to the deficit. Trillions. Folks, let me say it as clearly as I can. The trickle-down approach failed the middle class. It failed America. It blew up the deficit. It increased inequity, and it weakened our infrastructure. It stripped the dignity, pride, and hope out of communities, one after another, particularly through the Midwest, Western Pennsylvania, heading west.
I think you can find plenty of economists that would say the trickle-down was happening during the first 3 years of the Trump administration, but then COVID came and governments restricted the economy, and that caused problems.
I didn't come up with the name.
Then you've got the huge amount of debt that the feds put us in with the trillions of $4-point-some-odd trillion of COVID-19 relief. So there's a lot of, I guess, in a way, rewriting of history, some would argue, of President Biden talking about trickle-down doesn't work, and, the tax cuts didn't work. They were. We had a rocking economy in 2019, but then COVID comes along, and it wasn't necessarily the federal actions. It was the state-by-state actions of shutting down economies that led to a plummeting unemployment situation, I should say skyrocketing unemployment situation. The overall economy was just, it was devastation because governments were restricting economic activity. So from that baseline is where President Joe Biden is really saying, he's doing great things. He's doing great things. More from President Joe Biden yesterday in Chicago.
Bidenomics. I didn't come up with the name. I really didn't. I now claim it, but they're the ones that used it first. I got asked by a press person this morning, getting on a helicopter in Washington, why, when I asked you about Bidenomics a long time ago, you said you didn't know what it was. I said, I didn't name it Bidenomics. I didn't realize The Economist and the Wall Street Journal did. But I think it's a plan that I'm happy to call Bidenomics. And guess what? Bidenomics is working. When I took office, the pandemic was raging and our economy was reeling. Supply chains were broken, millions of people unemployed. Hundreds of thousands of small businesses on the verge of closing after so many had already closed. Literally hundreds of thousands on the verge of closing. Today, the U.S. has the highest economic growth rate, leading the world economies since the pandemic, the highest in the world. As Dick said, with his help, we created 13.4 million new jobs. More jobs in 2 years than any president has ever made in 4 and 2. We've seen record low unemployment for African Americans, record low unemployment for African Americans and Hispanic workers with disabilities. The lowest unemployment rate in 70 years for American women, and you make up half the economy and probably 2/3 of the brain. No, really, think about it.
So again, the president making a campaign speech, seeming to use the lows of the pandemic as the starting points, where he talks about, hey, there were serious problems, and we came out of it because of the Bidenomics, he says. But then he also talked about, inflation. It's half of where it was last year. But if you look at the chart, inflation skyrocketed when Biden took office, and is still really high and pinching people pretty hardcore. So he goes on and talks about energy, talks about, taxation. He wants to tax people more that make more money. He talked a bit about union workers and how he's really rooting for them to back his second term. But then he talked about the last bit of his address in Chicago. He talked about meeting with Xi Jinping. This is rather fascinating. This will help us get into the next conversation about whistleblowers coming forward, highlighting that investigations into the Biden family's finances were hindered. But here's President Biden yesterday.
I've long said, and I mean this, I was on the Tibetan Plateau with Xi Jinping. I traveled 17,000 miles with him. I've spoken with him more than any other head of state, because it started when I was vice president, and President Hu was the president, and he was the vice president. We knew he was going to be successful. It was inappropriate for Barack to spend that time with him, but I spent a lot of time with him. I met alone with him, just he and I, and a simultaneous interpreter 68 times, 68 hours, 68 times, more than 68 hours. By the way, I turned in all my notes.
Obviously a joke about Trump document case.
That's the God's truth. He asked me, we're in the Tibetan Plateau, and he asked me, he said, can you define America for me? I said, yes, in one word, and I meant it. Possibilities. Possibilities. We're a land of possibilities. And I told him it's never been a good bet to bet against America. Never.
So he met with Xi Jinping 67 times, he says, traveled 17,000 miles with him when he was vice president. Well, what else was going on when Biden was vice president? Whistleblower coming forward. We'll share some of that coming up next year on WMAY. So while President Joe Biden was talking about meeting with Xi Jinping while he was a vice president of the United States, knowing that he loves his son Hunter very much, and actually Hunter Biden was aboard Air Force 2 a whole bunch, what a whistleblower has to say from the IRS is rather interesting and intriguing. And let's go ahead and hear some of that. The whistleblower's last name is Shapley. Talked with CBS News, also talked with Fox News. Here's a little bit of what they had to say on Fox News last night.
And as far as the president's involvement in that?
So that's kind of the crux of one of the issues here, is that we weren't allowed to ask questions about Dad. We weren't allowed to ask about the big guy. We weren't allowed to include certain names and document requests and search warrants. So, we were precluded from following that line of questioning.
Are you convinced, looking back at this now, that this was an effort to protect President Biden and his family?
We were conducting an investigation of Hunter Biden, and we were trying to follow the normal process. We were trying to get to the bottom of it, and ultimately, if it was going to lead to another individual, we should follow that to determine what is actually happening. But there were definitely hindrances that I've never seen before in my 14 years concerning this investigation that didn't allow us to follow through on investigation of any other individual to include President Biden.
Tracking the money. How did it go? Where do you think it is?
The money that Hunter Biden earned? Well,
Where he spent it?
yeah, I mean, a lot of it is spent.
But as far as the investigation goes, that was part of it. Tracking where it came from, where it went to.
Oh, absolutely.
And you had that down?
We feel like we did, but there were certain things that, you know, when prosecutors don't allow you to put the subject's name on document requests or on search warrants, then, you know, it raises the possibility that there's more information out there we didn't find. But based on all of the financial records that we did find, you know, they've been analyzed.
So again, the whistleblower went on to talk about how Hunter Biden spent money and tried to write it off on his taxes for prostitutes, hotels for drug dealers, memberships to sex clubs. Altogether, he's saying about $8+ million went from Biden and possibly out to other Biden family members, including, quote, the big guy, but the IRS and the DOJ didn't allow for the investigation to proceed. So that's starting to come to a head. Whether or not that changes things for the 2024 election, we shall see. All eyes on it. All right, stay tuned.